Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome to my channel. Really appreciate you being here, and welcome to another episode of Mangles McCartney, where I interweave the releases of Paul with personal remembrances from my life and how the albums have significance, and in some cases insignificance. We'll get to a couple of those, I'm sure. But in this case, for this episode, folks, this is a great one for me because this album has a lot of meaning to me, a lot of personal remembrances with this album, and I'd like to share them with you now. Where do we leave off the story, though? Let's get back to that. It was late 1978, as you remember. Wings' Greatest had just come out that fall, coming into the holiday season. I was really digging that album, loving it, having a best of by Wings. It was great. I had met my future wife, remember, in the last video. Fall of 1978, she was a year younger than me. She was a junior in high school. I was a senior. And she came to work for the same Burger King, yes, Burger King, where I worked. And we established a friendship that eventually, we'll get to that part of the story eventually, grew into love and then marriage and then family and kids and grandkids. And here we are all these 40s plus years later. Unbelievable. 42 years ago I met my wife. Unreal. Anyway, a lot of life has gone by, huh, folks? A lot of water over the bridge, under the bridge, over the dam, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, it's just amazing how fast time has gone by, isn't it? But anyway, so I had met my future wife. We're friends. I'm starting my senior year in high school, and that's where we left off the story. Well, 1979 was just around the corner. And a lot of big changes were going to happen, okay? When 1979 hit, I was going to be graduating high school, the end of that second half of the school year, and I had made a big decision in my life around that time, folks, in early 79. Yes, I went down to the United States Military Recruiting Office for the United States Air Force, and I signed on the dotted line, folks, delayed enlistment program. I was set to go into the United States Air Force in early July 1979. So I knew the whole second half of my senior year what I was going to be doing after school ended. Okay, I knew that I had about a little over a month off after I graduated, and then that's it. I was heading down to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and I was going to spend several months down there in basic training and then my tech school training. I was going to be in the Air Force, 4 years active duty, 2 years reserve for a total of 6. All right, so that was coming. I signed, I made that decision, I was going. Mrs. Street was going to be going into her senior year of high school. So for that whole first year that I was in the Air Force, she was going to still be in high school. So we were friends and still friends. So coming into that first half of 1979, we were both still working at the Burger King together. And then, what do you know, March of 79, Paul comes out with a brand new single, Good Night Tonight, backed with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering. What a great single, folks. What a great single. But I have to be totally honest, I loved the B-side more than the A-side at first. I really did. And to this day, I still think Daytime, Nighttime Suffering is a fabulous song and really deserves more credit and more recognition than it ever got. I think it should have been on an album proper. I think it should have been a lead single. I think it should have definitely been an A-side. Nothing against Good Night Tonight. Good Night Tonight was a little slower of a burn for me. When it first came out, I was a little bit like, kind of disco-y, you know, back in those days when you were a young teenager in high school, and, you know, disco was kind of like, you know, if you're a rock and roll guy, you certainly were like, disco, and, you know, disco's no good. Yeah, I won't say the other word. Remember the old catchphrase, disco, disco. Anyway, I won't go there, but you know what I'm talking about if you're from my age category. So, you know, that was like a thing. You kind of jumped on the bandwagon that music was no good. And I'm not going to stand here and say I love disco now. No, a lot of it I do not still enjoy, don't enjoy it. But I've grown to appreciate a lot of it. Some of it is pretty good. And in the case of Good Night Tonight, I've certainly grown to love that song. It's a great pop song, great melody, very catchy, very danceable. I have nothing against the song now, but I still prefer the B-side a little more. But that was great to get that single from Paul. It was nice to have it come out. And then we find out that in a couple of months, Paul and Wings are going to be coming out with a brand new album called Back to the Egg. And folks, it came out in, I think, June 8th, 1979. And I think it's kind of funny that it came out June 8th. I believe it's the 8th, because or this won't make sense what I'm going to say, but I think it was June 8th. And it only made number 8 on the charts. Comes out June 8th, and it rose to number 8, and that was it. Now, for most bands out there, you'd get a number 8, a top 10 album on the charts. You'd be like, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But this was kind of a letdown for Paul, in the sense that his last studio album had been number 1, which was Wings at the Speed of Sound. I'm not sure what chart placing Wings Over America made, but I know it did really good. I know it did really well, and it was definitely right up there. If not number 1, it was right up there. So this was kind of like the first kind of letdown for Paul. Here he was, Joe and Jimmy had left the band a couple of years previous. Now he's got Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley, 2 great, fabulous people, by the way. I love them as additions to the band. Paul was in a big life transition period himself. He had finally left Capitol EMI and signed a big 5-album deal with Columbia. And this was the first fruits of that deal with Columbia Records, Back to the Egg. So you got to look at the whole picture and think that it probably, for the people, some of the people at Columbia and Paul maybe, they looked at this as kind of a letdown because it only made number 8 on the charts and didn't sell as well as his other albums. I feel bad for Steve and Lawrence because they were so great and such wonderful musicians and such great people. I've met them at the fest and they're both fabulous. And they were official members of Wings, albeit briefly, but they were there. Now, a lot of people like to say this is Paul's punk album, and I don't agree with that. I think that's a bunch of malarkey. I think, yes, Paul was trying to embrace new wave on here a little taste of punk, rock and roll, some contemporary trends, but I wouldn't call this his punk album, not at all. I mean, the punkish song on the album was probably Spin It On, and it's not really punk, folks, if you really listen to it. And, you know, it's kind of has punk flavors to it, but it's not a punk rock song per se. To me, this album is just Paul finally rocking out full tilt. This is his rock and roll album as far as I'm concerned. And there's some beautiful ballads on here and wonderful melodies also, but this is a rock and roll album from Paul, folks, and I personally love it. He was planning to return to touring with this album, and we all know what happened with that. It kind of crash landed after the first of the year with the Japanese tour there, the beginning of the tour. But I think this is a wonderful album. This would have been a wonderful album to tour the United States with, and I firmly believe if Paul had had the opportunity to do a full world tour of this album would be regarded much higher now by people. I think it would have done much better on the charts. I just think overall it got shortchanged because of all the stuff that happened, and it just, you know, people kind of looked down at it after that. That's just, you know, my opinion. But I think it's wonderful. The first single from it came out right around when the album came out. That was Getting Closer, backed with Spin It On. Again, not doing as well as Paul's past singles. It only made number 20. Like I said, Good Night Tonight early in the year did number 5. Getting Closer only made number 20, which is okay, respectable. I really love Getting Closer. I really love the next single, which was Arrow Through Me, an Old Siam Sir. That came out August of 79. That only made number 29, so even lower on the charts. And I don't understand it. I don't understand why this album didn't do better, why the singles didn't do better. Because for my money, this is a top-notch album from Paul and Wings. It's a fabulous album, and I'll always say that. Now, when this album came out, I only had a month or so, a little less than a month before I was going to be going in the U.S. Air Force. You know, I think it was July 2nd, I went in the Air Force. This came out June 8th. And I listened to this as much as I could, folks, while I was home. Because I knew when I left, I was just leaving with very few items. Couldn't take any records with me or anything. I was going to boot camp. Records are out, okay? You can't bring those with you. I don't know how it is nowadays, but I don't think so. So this was going to stay home. So I listened to this nonstop, I think, for that last month I was home. I really wanted to drink it in, take it all in, and enjoy it for what it was, a brand new McCartney album. And I loved it so much on first listen that I really could not stop getting it. I couldn't get enough of this album. I found when I went into the Air Force that July, said goodbye to Mrs. Street, and we promised we would write each other while I was in. But I remember getting into the Air Force, and after basic training was done, I stayed down in San Antonio for my technical school training. And so I was there for another couple of months in San Antonio and had my dorm room. So I remember guys were buying those little boom boxes back then with the like one little speaker on it, but you could put a cassette in, listen to AM, FM radio. And so cassettes became the thing back then, at least for me anyway. Couldn't have albums, wasn't going to be home for a long time to get to my albums. So I started buying cassettes. And this is one of the first cassettes I ever bought on my own, folks, when I was getting into buying cassettes. I had had a few cassettes earlier in my life that my parents had given me when I was younger, when I had one of those little push deck cassette players you had in the early mid-70s. But it was 1979 when I really got heavily into cassettes, because that's all we had was those little boom boxes. So I bought Back to the Egg. It was my first cassette I think I ever bought. And I found it was very popular with the guys I was friendly with in the Air Force. A lot of people had the cassette of this and they were into it and enjoying it, which made me feel good that Paul really had put out a good rocker, a great album that people could really get into and enjoy. So whenever I hear this album, folks, it takes me back to that period, that transition period of going from a boy to a man, so to speak. Going from my high school days, working at the Burger King, to that period of graduating high school, to that period of joining the United States Air Force and going into boot camp and getting into this album, that whole period of listening, this was the soundtrack of my life at that moment. So this album takes me back there, and it means a lot to me. And I just always will say that this is a great album, a wonderful album, and big changes were about to happen again over the next year or so. Like I said, my wife was a year behind me. So Mrs. Street, after her senior year coming up in 1980, she had decided to become a nurse. And I give her all the credit in the world for that. She made that determination that she was going to go to nursing school after high school. And that's where her journey was going to lead her. Paul, obviously, we know he had some big changes coming at the end of 1979, coming into 1980. Big life changes for him. It would be the dissolution of Wings. Wings would fall apart. Lawrence and Steve would be out of a job in Wings. Paul would move on to New Frontiers. I had moved on to New Frontiers. I'm sure many of you at that time in your life, if you were around, were moving on to new things in your life and new challenges and whatnot. So this is a big, meaningful album to me, folks. It has a lot of meaning as far as transition in life. And I'll always love it for that reason. And just to show you, I do have another version of it still in the shrink with the hype stickers all on it. Show you that right there. So anyway, folks, that's my memories of this one, Back to the Egg. Very important album to me. More changes coming down the road, folks. More changes. So let's get into this one right now. Enjoy it. Go give it a spin. Give it a listen. I know I will. I'll talk to you all later. I hope you enjoyed this episode as we continue on the journey in Matt Mangles McCartney. Bless you all. Take care. Bye-bye.